Okay, so I will now share my screen and do my best. Okay. So, oh boy. So this, like many of, for those of you who haven't read Alison Wylie before, she has this extremely rich way of writing that can often make it very hard to sort of unpick and find the arguments, but I find it often incredibly worthwhile to do so. In this paper, she has been basically, as you can probably tell, she's responding to or kind of writing a kind of summary thing or something to a collection of papers about community archaeology. And I thought that, or collaborative or community archaeology, like many movements in archaeology, they have multiple names and it gets very confusing. So I'm going to do my best to kind of contextualize a lot of what's going on, and then sort of go through the various sort of arguments and perspectives that are within the paper. But I should sort of first lay out, I am, I wouldn't say uniquely unqualified, but fairly unqualified to speak about a lot of the issues in here, which might be quite good insofar as it means that I don't really know exactly how to think about or how to approach these kinds of issues. And so it means that you're in a really good position to help me. So why don't we start by understanding what colonialism is and then trying to understand what decolonialism is, at least insofar as I can get a grip on it, before moving into a little bit of this in the context of archaeology. And then finally, that will set us up to try and understand, I guess, why community archaeology looks the way that it does. And then we'll dive into the paper to talk a little bit about the kinds of objections that Alison thinks has been risen to it and the kinds of responses she sees them giving and she gives on their behalf. So what does colonialism look like? Well, here's the British Empire in the 1920s. All that red, lots of colonialism. You'll see that Britain is a very small little place up in the top. I went and had a look at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on colonialism, on decolonialism rather, and I was quite surprised about how actually limited the definitions they were using were. But here's the sort of shtick from the SCP. So they say that colonialism is a practice of domination, which involves the subjugation of one people to another. And so very roughly, people from places like Britain have moved to other countries and dominated the people who were there, subjugated them in various ways. And for me, speaking as someone who comes from, is a colonial, I come from New Zealand, they came from Britain, sort of processes of sort of understanding what it is to be colonized have often been something which, because I, in some sense, lived within it in lots of ways, it took me a while to be able to sort of see it. One example where I did really feel like I was seeing colonialism in retrospect was the first time that I went and visited Scotland, which is where some of my ancestors came from. And it became very clear that actually a lot of the sort of celebrated Scottish things, I went to Highland Games, and it suddenly struck me that these were games that were developed in the late 19th century-ish after the clearances of the Highlands, and really represented this kind of capture, in a way, of what had been a sort of much kind of richer culture and sort of fitting it into a much more sort of marketable and much more martial, actually, aspect of that culture. And it suddenly sort of struck me that, even Scotland itself had been gone through this kind of process of domination and subjugation. So the way that Conan Reddy, this is in the SCP article, think about it is what's often called settler colonialism. So this is the practice of colonialism. It usually involves the transfer of a population to a new territory where the arrivals lived as permanent settlers while maintaining political allegiance to their country of origin. So there's a few aspects here that are worth kind of picking apart. So first, you've got this aspect of transferring a population to a new territory. And this, of course, can happen in many different ways, right? Famously in Australia, some of the transfers were done as a sort of penal colony. In the United States, a lot of that transfer, at least for Europeans, was often in indentured servitude. Of course, the people from Africa who were put there were taken over as slaves. In places like New Zealand, it was sort of more middle class in a certain way. The land was divvied out and folks were kind of sent over. Then you have places like, for instance, India, where colonialization involved, in some sense, less the transfer of a population, at least not on a large scale, but more kind of imperial control. The historian Schumacher makes a very nice point, I think, that this seems like a fairly limited way of thinking about colonialism. A lot of it is focused on sort of settler colonialism, which makes sense if, like me, coming from somewhere like New Zealand, colonialism is sort of primarily understood as sort of settler colonialism. But Schumacher points out there are many, many different varieties. She says the many varieties of colonialism and their points of intersection suggest that historians could elaborate on the trend started by this approach, by thinking about settler colonial studies, and investigate colonialization as these multifaceted affairs that did a whole bunch of stuff in a whole bunch of different directions. And so she, in this little post, gives us this huge list of different types of colonialism. And I found when I sort of went through and read the list, I was like, oh yeah, that all makes sense. These are all these sort of different types of colonialism, all of which involve really, to be honest, nasty, bad things happening. And so that's how we can think about colonialism. I find it useful to think about colonialism in terms of certain forms of extraction. This is the definition I'm using. I don't think it's a brilliant definition insofar as there are going to be cases that we probably don't think of as being colonization that nonetheless involve folks having things taken without justification. It's also circular because, of course, I use the word colonizer and colonized without defining them, but hopefully the philosophers will forgive me. But the basic idea is that we can understand these colonial relationships in cases where the colonizer takes something, right? And what sort of something might we have in mind? Well, it could be something like material goods, straightforwardly, right? It could just be extraction of minerals, extraction of forests, so on and so forth. It could also be, of course, sort of cultural goods. Here, taking something is perhaps not put so well, but sort of the erasure and subjugation and disappearance of those cultures. We could think about it in those terms. And also what matters, I think, often for our discussion will be kind of epistemic goods, right? When people think about colonization in the academy, it's often, at least these days, thought of in terms of, as it were, using knowledge from colonized people without, as it were, the right, in non-kosher ways, let's put it that way. What sorts of without justification might we have in mind here? Well, there is a sort of the list that you would kind of imagine, right? If you're taking these somethings in an oppressive way, in a way that causes physical harm, perhaps more interestingly, ways that involve a lack of consent, or more broadly, things that involve a lack of autonomy. There's a certain sense in which folks don't have, are sort of having their autonomy restricted in virtue of the way in which things are being extracted from them, and I guess particularly also a sort of history of any of the above, right? As we'll sort of talk about in a second, these colonial processes leave a kind of deep, deep mark. And so that's a kind of first sketch at what counts as colonialism. And frankly, I'm not particularly interested in getting a good analysis of it, largely because, to be honest, I don't think colonialism is the sort of thing these sort of very complex, rich sort of historical notions don't really allow. They're not a good approach by saying something is colonial if and only if, right? So think of this as a kind of, for me, a useful way of thinking about what colonialism looks like. So if that's what colonialism looks like, how should we think about decolonization, right? So decolonization is a term that is, it's one of these terms which is which is both, I think, extremely important, but also has been sort of caught up in various very annoying kind of culture wars. It's right up there with sort of race studies sometimes as a term that actually has a very specific and very useful meaning, which nonetheless is used as a kind of boogie bear towards boogie bear. What do I mean by that? Used as if it were a bad thing to by various people who we shouldn't trust. But anyway. There's a kind of very straightforward materialist conception we might have of decolonization, right? Here's the British Empire in the 1920s. What's happened by the sort of 1950s is the empire is sort of broken up, and we have the British Commonwealth of Nations. There's a sense in which places like India, being granted their independence, is a certain form of decolonization. They're being granted legal autonomy from the state that had colonized them. And so that's a very sort of literal sort of sense of decolonization. But often when people are speaking of decolonization, they mean something a little bit richer than that. And one way that I kind of find striking as a way of thinking about it is we've been looking at a lot of maps. This is what the world looks like when I imagine the world, when I think of it. What's something we might notice about this way of drawing the world? Well, the focus is on the North Atlantic. There's a big line, right, drawing in towards Europe. Europe's in the very, very center of this map. Why do we draw the world like this? Well, we draw the world like this because the people who ended up deciding what the maps looked like were from that part of the world, right? And you might think that that sort of focus on that sort of European perspective is a thing which shapes a lot of the way that we think about history, the way that we think about identity, and so on and so forth, right? The norm is taken to be this kind of European perspective, and others are kind of, and other folks are often kind of othered in virtue of that, right? So a very cheesy way of thinking about this is just how different the world seems to us when we just simply invert it. If you just turn it upside down, I find the world suddenly becomes a strangely unfamiliar looking place. And yet presenting the world like this is just as true as presenting the world with Europe directly in the center, right? There's no fact of the matter about what way up the world is. And so one way you can think about decolonization is in a sense as decentering. It's about making Europe not the center of the story. Some people sort of tend to imagine somehow decolonization involves the erasure of what happened in Europe, right? Somehow, if I'm decolonizing, now I don't get to read the big books, the great books or something like that. And that's not really what it's about at all. What it's about is reading these things in different contexts. It's about having the narrative be led by different places. It's about not assuming that the central narrative that everything else is built upon or built across is the sort of, as it were, European colonial perspective. Now, it's worth noting, and I think this is an interesting objection to this kind of project as it goes on in the academy, is that it kind of almost gosh, I've forgotten the word, makes decolonization a kind of almost metaphor, right? Thinking about it as sort of decentering. And there are folks who sort of complain about this, and I think for interesting kinds of reasons. So here's Tuck and Yang from their Decolonization is Not a Metaphor paper, which is very provocative. They say, because settler colonialism is built upon an entangled triad structure of settler, native, slave, the decolonial desires of white, non-white, immigrant, post-colonial, and oppressed people can similarly be entangled in resettlement, reoccupation, and reinhabitation that actually furthers settler colonialism. This is a version of this master's tool claim we're going to make downstream. The metaphorization of decolonization makes possible a set of evasions or settler moves to innocent that problematically attempts to reconcile settler guilt and complicity and rescue settler futurity. People who write in this work really have this tendency to have these like lists of different people and these sort of claims that are quite big. But I take it the sort of central point here is that if decolonization just means these shifts in, for instance, what I teach to undergraduates. I suddenly try and have some things in my undergraduate school that, I don't know, I teach some Chinese philosophy or something like that. If that's all I'm doing, then chances are I'm just going to be recapitulating various types of kind of power structures and so on and so forth. I don't really know where to fall on this. It's not up to me to decide on that, but I think it's worth noting that there are interesting objections you might have to this notion of decolonization as sort of intellectual decentering in these ways. As sort of movements in kind of indigenous or colonized, however you want to call people, thought has sort of progressed, you find various sort of movements and thinkers who are in the business of trying to think about what intellectual sovereignty looks like for kind of indigenous groups. So one person who works in, what he would call Indigenous Environmental Studies and Sciences, Kyle White, has these sort of really interesting ideas about Indigenous conceptions of resilience. His sort of main notion of resilience that he thinks is particular to some of the groups that sort of he works with in North America, that he's a part of some of those groups in North America. They think about resilience as a feature of a sort of social group embedded and part of an ecosystem, as opposed to the way that ecologists, like academic ecologists, think of it as a property of an ecosystem alone, right? And here's just a sort of, something that sort of he has to say just to get us a sense about where these folks are often coming from. Kyle White says, perhaps most important for the well-being of Indigenous peoples everywhere, Indigenous environmental studies and science make strong statements about what Indigenous reconciliation with settler and colonial nations will require. While it's all very nice that people are apologizing and, and we're forgiving or whatever, Indigenous people are demanding reclamation of Indigenous lands and waters and recognition of Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination on those lands and waters. One thing that's kind of interesting here is these claims of Indigenous sovereignty really, I think, are often an interesting tension with certain types of maybe communitarian or sort of liberal conceptions of the way that we should live, right? This practice, Indigenous Environmental Studies and Sciences, sheds light on how reclamation and sovereignty entail the capacity of Indigenous peoples to rebuild and continue complex moral relationships that can promote economic, cultural, and social resilience for the sake of future generations' well-being. So the thought here is something like Indigenous peoples have knowledge and have social systems and have ways of doing business, roughly, which are often better than, in lots of ways, the sort of systems that sort of settler colonialism brings with it. And to an extent, I guess, regardless of what better than counts as, one might think that given the kind of history they have and the kind of subjugation they've been under, that sovereignty is a sort of critical, important value for them. Okay. What about archaeology then? What do we say about archaeology? So both, at least as I encountered them as an undergraduate, in my experience might not generalize to, we've got people from very many different places here, but my conception of anthropology and archaeology has always been that they are sciences that are working very much under the burden of their own histories. Anthropologists and archaeologists, at least those English-speaking ones who I've have learnt from, are very, very aware that anthropology and archaeology have this extremely colonial origin. And this has meant sort of various sort of interesting things about the way that anthropologists and archaeologists often situate themselves epistemically. I think this explains, to some extent, some of the ways in which anthropologists don't trust quantification very much. They often worry that quantification is simplifying. They're often right that quantification is simplifying, but some of the worry there, I think, stems from anthropology having been very much a kind of tool of extremely repressive colonial powers in the past, and indeed a lot of that tool came through from them basically counting people. So I think that's part of the story there. To get a sense of sort of where this is coming from, I thought I would just briefly draw on Myra Gold's PhD thesis. So she has, there's some big block quotes in this, I'm very sorry. Myra's work is on the history of Egyptology and the development of 19th century Egyptology. And I just think it's interesting the way that she speaks about this. So she says, on 15th of July 2019, the Egyptian novelist and political commentator Abdaf Suif resigned from the British Museum's Board of Trustees in response to several troubling policies, particularly the institution's refusal to participate in repatriation debates. So repatriation debate is basically, if you go to the British Museum is fantastic. Like if you get a chance to go to the British Museum, it is wild, the stuff they have there, which is kind of cool for the perspective of me getting to go see them, but kind of horrific when you think about where they came from and who perhaps should have them. So repatriation is roughly, can we please have our stuff you stole back, roughly. And the complaints that Adolf Swift gave were succinct. The British Museum, born and bred in empire and colonial practice, is coming under scrutiny, and yet it hardly speaks. It's this idea that the British Museum really should be at least having an opinion in this debate that so fundamentally involves what it is as an institution. The issue is especially pertinent for the museum's collection of Egyptian antiquities, which is the largest outside of Egypt. Right? These were unsurprisingly acquired during the 19th century. This culture of silence around the legacies of colonial era archaeology has also fundamentally shaped training and practice, collective identity, and especially histories of Egyptology. So the idea is how you do Egyptology, some features of even current Egyptology, it can be explained as being due to its colonial origin. Egyptology as a discipline, as Christina Riggs has not repeatedly argued, remains markedly disinterested in the circumstances of its knowledge production, despite or because of the implication in the operations of colonialism, which maybe makes Egyptology a bit different from archaeology. The archaeologists I've spoken to do seem to be extremely aware of this. The colonial roots of Egyptology remain a pesky, uncomfortable truth for many. It invites follow-up questions about how the unequal power relations that shaped Egyptology's disciplinary growth in the 19th century still operates today. And for Myra, she's particularly interested in how this plays out in fieldwork. And as a sort of historian of science, it's kind of unsurprising that she's looking at the ways in which sort of various interesting epistemic and power structures within fieldwork sort of seem to reproduce and recapitulate various types of, colonized kinds of structures. Hopefully you sort of get the general gist there. And it may be that there's sort of ways that we can think about movements in archaeology, some of which are, fairly recent, in ways that look kind of like extractive colonialism, right? Let's have an example. And again, I am kind of, how should I put in this? This is a bit speculative, but we'll see what you think. So we've talked a little bit about how if you are trying to get from a trace to a past event, what you want is a kind of hypothesis, a hypothesis that says events of that type leave traces with those features. One of the main, but also the most contentious ways that archaeologists have done this is through ethnographic analogies, right? Ethnographic analogies take an enormous number of forms, right? So for those who aren't archaeologists here, very roughly, an ethnographic analogy involves grabbing ethnographic information, so maybe a report that you hope an anthropologist, but sometimes a missionary, various people have written about some community, and you, in some sense, use that to understand the relationship between the trace and the past event. Something like this. There's a lot of different ways that ethnographic analogies are used, but at least sometimes it looks like you're sort of constraining your hypotheses based on these ethnographic reports. Archaeologists often distinguish between direct ethnographic analogies. So here you're kind of assuming that there's some continuity of practice. So you're thinking that these folks are in some sense the descendants of the folks that you're studying on, and you think there's some reason that these things have been sort of combined, continual. And indirect ethnographic analogy, where you don't think that there's a sort of cultural connection between them, rather you think that they're kind of sort of similar in some way. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of sort of strange things you might think about. You might wonder about what assumptions about, the way that humans work you might be using, you might need if you're using notions of indirect ethnographic analogy. And here's, once you sort of seep yourself in a bit of decolonialism, you might start worrying a little bit about what's actually going on with an ethnographic analogy. I'll just get back to these things in a minute. You might think something like this. Well, we've got the archaeologist. The archaeologist has got institutional authority. They have expertise, and they get ownership over their studies. After all, it's the archaeologist who publishes the paper, publishes the book, gets gets to wear the big professor's hat, go to all the big fancy dinners, and so on and so forth. The local communities are, in the anthropological case, they're informants. They're the people who are just kind of telling you stuff, and in some contexts, they might also be labor. And so fair to say, it kind of looks like there's an arrow going from local communities to the archaeologist. It looks as if there is a process of extraction going on here. There's a question about what it is these local communities might be getting back. Remember the way that I defined, so I'm thinking of colonialism here as in terms of unjustified extraction. You might say something like this: even if local communities are not being harmed, it is still unjust to be, as it were, taking this stuff from them and you gaining lots of praise and stuff without them necessarily knowing that that's what's going on, without you providing some kind of recompense, without them, et cetera, right? And so it does look suspiciously like a kind of extractive colonialism, this sort of use of things like ethnographic analogy. And you might think that this kind of picture that I've given you, where the archaeologist is playing this role, kind of fits what you might think of as a very traditional idea about what science looks like, right? The sorts of values that a scientist will have when they're engaging with other peoples, right? There's a notion of being disinterested, right? So when you are a zoologist and you're out in the field, you're not supposed to try and save the rabbit or whatever it is you're studying. You're supposed to watch them get torn apart, right? Despite your love for them or something like this. There's this disinterested, disconnected, right? Here, descriptive, I mean kind of non-interventional. You're not supposed to be changing your system of study unless it's in these experimental contexts. You're not part of the system. You are apart from it. You're detached, right? And that other stuff as well. It seems like the goal here, as Nichols describing, talking about the goal of decolonizing archaeology, which is what sort of community archaeology I think is reasonably understood as being about, is addressing this kind of imbalance, right? There's this imbalance between the discipline, the archaeologists, and the descendant communities, that are called local communities, regarding who makes decisions about, who has access to, who controls information, and who benefits from archaeological endeavors. And so how would we represent the change? Well, it might look something like this, right? This is a version where somehow you're taking stuff, but you're giving stuff back, but it seems pretty clear that it's supposed to look a bit like this, right? Often these sorts of more I don't know if extreme is the right word, but more extreme collaborative archaeology often seems to be about breaking down, in some sense, the barriers between archaeologists and those sort of local communities. That's kind of the thought. So what does community archaeology actually looks like in practice? So I'm not going to give any examples because of sort of time constraints and also my own straightforward ignorance. I'm sure Alison will be able to talk about these in a lot more detail. But here's sort of one way that folks have thought about the way that sort of collaboration might work. So don't know how to pronounce those names. Those two people sort of think about it as a kind of continuum from resistance to participation to collaboration. And the thing to really focus on here is this notion of collaboration, and think about how different this seems to look to the way that scientists usually study systems, right? Typically, if I'm, say, an anthropologist and I'm going in to study a society, what I don't do is rock up and be like, what shall we find out? Right? I'm not supposed to have a discussion with my informants beforehand about what the goal of this study should be, right? Also, information is not going to flow freely between the anthropologist and the people they're studying because, to be honest, if an anthropologist was studying me, I would probably rather not read their ethnographies, right? The stuff they're writing about me, some of which might be things that I don't really want to know about, if you get the idea. This notion of sort of stakeholder being fully involved, the idea is they are kind of doing the things you're doing. This is not a project where the archaeologist has somehow special authority, at least in the more extreme cases. I'm not so sure what to make of whether support is like solicited or tacit. I'm not entirely sure what they mean by tacit in this context, but whatever. And also there's a kind of, the idea here is like success means that everyone has their needs met, right? So it's like the project fails if the archaeologist gets what they want, but the local communities don't. That's a version of the project failing. And as we'll see, it often means that if you're taking this very seriously, sometimes you might not actually do it. You might choose to not do some research that you otherwise would. A more kind of sort of, I guess, practical kind of process sort of thing for what community-based research looks like is given by Gonzalez here. So first, right, I'm just going to sort of go through these quickly, right? So the idea is, you're going in as the archaeologist and saying, we want to set some standards and protocols, and the local community and you work together to make those. Again, really different from how we usually think about sort of this type of science, right? Also the research goals, right? You're not just testing hypothesis, you're also kind of doing stuff that arises from and is requested by the community and their perspectives. They get paid the same as you. That makes things massively expensive, right? Or I guess you don't pay yourself very much. They have ownership. This is number 4. This is something which I think is crucially interesting, is the idea that like what gets done with the stuff, you have to have permission from them to publish, but also they have sort of control over what is done with that published work so far as they can. They're in charge of particularly research on sensitive topics. I think number 6 is interesting, right? Part of what sort of happens, has happened in the past is, the archaeologist or the anthropologist kind of parachutes in, does their thing, and then gets out again. There's this idea here that this is a collaborative process that actually involves a long-term commitment to that community. Geology that is paying attention to the ancestors of these folks, then you're not just parachuting in. There is a sort of long-term commitment to so with methods, and also I think 8 is the sort of really interesting one as well, is that one of the goals of your research isn't just answering cool questions, finding out lots of research. It's also actually giving the community power and capacity to manage and control its own cultural resources. So it does, I think, look really different to, an archaeologist, say, using, sometimes you have archaeologists doing, for instance, ethnographic work for the purposes of using ethnographic analogy. This looks extremely different to that. So we have this notion, community archaeology. And as we saw in the paper, there are many people who kind of don't like it in various interesting ways. And I'm going to do my best to kind of systematize these a bit. So in the paper, Alison is kind of referring to like lots of different things, and they seem to, it's a bit of a snake biting its own tail sometimes, trying to work out what the different objections might be. But I'm going to have a go at kind of systematizing these, and very much just a go. So one set of these we might think of as the claim that community archaeology is bad science, right? And one of the things that Alison makes clear in her paper is this isn't really what anyone in the collection she's talking to is worrying about. And I think the implication there is that folks who are doing community archaeology are already not worried about this particular issue. But I take it there's a bunch of ways that you might worry that community archaeology is bad science. One might be something like this. Archaeology as a science is giving us information for humanity. This matters for us as humans. And there's something supposed to be something really bad about making it beholden to the power or the interests of some special interest group. Right. And so there's this idea here is that regardless of sort of histories of colonialism or people being oppressed, look, this is for humanity in some sense. Hopefully it's kind of, to me, it's just kind of straightforwardly obvious that an archaeologist doing something doesn't somehow mean that it's for humanity. You might think that doing something for the purposes of publishing it in academic journals seems to be a good way of academic journals getting richer. So it's not very obvious to me that this line kind of this kind of idealism about science gets off the ground in the first instance. More epistemically, there's this idea of sort of an anti-standpoint epistemology. So standpoint epistemology roughly says, if you people who have had certain experiences, who live in certain ways, simply have knowledge that people who have not lived in those ways do not have, right? And there's this kind of idea, this sort of tied into this universal idea of science. Look, there's no special authority attributed to anyone, and community archaeology seems to imply that there is. And also, and this comes up in a lot of them, there's a sort of notion of essentializing. There's this idea that you're treating this community as a kind of block kind of community, and that's bad, right? And here's kind of Alison summarizing it. The very idea of an Indigenous archaeology, or an archaeology informed or led by Indigenous partners, is a non-starter. The universalizing goals of an archaeology that serves humanity, society at large, takes precedence over community-specific interests. This is Alison's sort of capturing this thought. Another set of objections, which are very much coming from a different place, I'm going to think of as the sort of master's tools objections. Here the idea is roughly this. Look, if you're going in and doing all this really nice, hanging out with these, Indigenous people, letting them kind of have some control over your stuff, but you're still publishing the stuff in archaeological journals, you're still using the standard practices and procedures of archaeology, all you're going to be doing is reiterating the same kind of problem. So the idea is, look, just including Indigenous people in archaeology doesn't solve the problem. In fact, it might perpetuate it. This thought kind of reminded me a little bit of complaints against girl bosses. I don't know anything about this book. I just picked it because it looked like a funny example of a girl boss. So what's the idea of a girl boss? Well, it's a a woman who is extremely successful in various types of sort of capitalistic practices. Maybe she starts her own business and so on and so forth. And there's a complaint that says something like this: look, it doesn't really meet the goals of feminism in any interesting way to have women also being involved in these like really gross, exploitative patriarchal structures. And I take it there's a sort of similar claim being made here. And so here's sort of an example. This is sort of, again, Alison trying to capture this idea. The institutional and economic conditions under which archaeology is practiced enforce complicity with the eliminationist agendas of settler colonial regimes and the economic imperatives of late-stage capitalism. So basically, you're just fitting them within that system. And so because they're now forced to be complicit with it as well. So a complicit that is perpetuated by self-delusion and complacency, deliberate misrepresentation and evasion, strong words. Another one that is only mentioned kind of in passing, and I'm not really sure what to do with, I'm kind of going to call paternalism. And this is this point that I suspect some people here might be thinking, because a lot of this discussion very clearly has been developed in the context of Anglophone Indigenous interactions in places like North America and Australia. And it has a very particular idea about what the power imbalance is between these groups. And so this kind of, I'm calling it sort of paternalism, I'm not sure why, but there's this idea that, look, there's no one picture of power and capacity between archaeologists and communities. There are cases where the communities are significantly more powerful. There are cases where capacity is very, very different between the archaeologists and the communities, and so on and so forth. And so having this kind of very standard picture of what the power relationship is sort of misrepresenting the diversity of these groups, is the take it the idea. And the final one is this kind of really interesting kind of argument, which I'm calling no basis for criticism, by which I mean, maybe the casual way of putting it is, look, these wishy-washy community archaeologists aren't willing to take a stand on anything because they're just trying to be friends with everyone. And the problem is as an archaeologist, you should be able to criticize and intervene on and change the communities that you're interacting with. And so I think the idea is this sort of, wet liberalism, if you want, essentializes communities and often sort of hides reactionary views within them, right? And this idea is archaeologists should be, in some sense, activist experts. Archaeological information can push back against the aspects of the communities they're in that are sort of reactionary in various ways. So here's Alison sort of characterizing this. Archaeologists should take a forthrightly critical and activist stance as experts, right? Your expertise in archaeology, I take it, well places you to provoke the people, tell uncomfortable truths, articulate explicit social critique, and actively intervene, right? So this one's kind of, I find this one really interesting because it's going like even further in various ways, but in a way that still keeps the idea of the archaeologist as the expert. I'm not entirely sure what to make of it, but I find it really interesting. Okay. So now we've got these, I'm just going to go through and sketch the way that Alison sort of responds to them. So as for the bad science stuff, so a lot of this is sort of founded in what these days philosophers of science would call the value-free ideal. And it's probably worth our time for me to just sort of sketch the sort of arguments that are often thrown around in this area. Those of you who are philosophers of science will roll your eyes as I put up a picture of Heather Douglas, but I'm going to go with it anyway. So here's a kind of very sort of typical view about the nature of science. So here's science. We've got our scientist in her little science circle. And then we've got everything else. We've got society with the sad businessman. He represents society, I guess. And this very standard picture of the relationship between science and society looks something like this. The scientist gets results. The scientist then tells the not scientists what the results are, and then it's kind of up to everyone else to work out whether they should accept that theory or not. Scientists are just reporting the results of their experiments. Scientists aren't making any judgments about policy. Science is apolitical. This is this kind of notion of this kind of value-free ideal. And Heather Douglas and others have given, I think, very simple arguments to show that this can't be right. And the simple way of thinking about it is just that within science, there are enormous amounts of judgments that you make, and those judgments make a difference to the result you end up having. And insofar as that result makes a difference to the world outside of science, then those decisions cannot be thought of as apolitical. So decisions about what methodology you use, which data gathering techniques you use, how you interpret your data, all of those decisions along the way, insofar as they make a difference to what your results will be, and insofar as your results matter, which sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, that means that those decisions are fairly straightforwardly laying with the kind of obligations that those values have. And so if you say, oh, I'm apolitical, I'm not making any judgments as a scientist, you're basically being willfully ignorant, is the thought of these kinds of arguments. Another one, which is, that's sort of standard, the sorts of things that lots of philosophers of science and indeed STS people and anthropologists of science would sort of say. But interestingly, I think that there's a further point made by community archaeologists, which is, look, these kinds of encounters with local communities can often make for better archaeology. And the way this usually works is by sort of unsettling assumptions. There's this idea, archaeologists are always, anytime you talk to an archaeologist, they start worrying about the way in which their framework is constraining them to certain questions, and they worry a lot about principles, they worry a lot about sort of the space of alternative hypotheses in lots of ways. And there's this idea that being confronted by very different people and different perspectives as a way of unsettling those kinds of assumptions. So this idea, hey, it actually makes for better science. What about this master's tools stuff, right? This master's tools stuff says, look, if you're just including Indigenous people in a oppressive extractive system in the first instance, it's not entirely clear how that's supposed to help. And Alison gives, I think, a very sort of complicated and interesting kind of answer to this problem. She talks about something I'm hoping to try and for her to explain to me a little bit. She talks about sort of a notion of sort of a dis-narrative. So what does she mean by a dis-narrative? Well, it seems to be something which is often emphasizing sort of mistakes and errors that were made. So she says that a dis-narrative that is useful in this action guiding normative sense will be one that provides an understanding of the motivations and the material and structural conditions that configured the space of possibilities navigated in a particular case. So in other words, you've tried to do some community archaeology and something's kind of not worked, things have kind of gone wrong, and telling that dis-narrative, telling that story really helps us start figuring out, well, what are the various things to look out for? What kinds of tools do I need to be able to navigate, this kind of really sort of unfamiliar way of doing archaeology, right? And it allows us to really pick out those instances, those counterfactuals that conspire to undermine the best intentions, compromising action and enforcing complicity. And so the idea here very roughly is something like, look, we have to do more than include Indigenous people, no doubt, but also we're able to reflect upon whether or not we're doing what this master's tool thing complains. You're not guaranteed into doing it. Indeed, as she points out, there's a sense in which the people have made this objection of somewhat misuse the notion of master's tools. The master's tools are supposed to be the sort of strategies that are used rather than the intellectual, technical, material, and institutional resources that elites have access to. So for instance, an elite group, say, might use various types of technical tools to divide people in various ways. So maybe an example might be sort of redlining that was used in various cities in the United States that basically sort of changed the way that districting worked and mortgaging worked, such that black people in America were much less able to get mortgages and so on and so forth. That's a strategy that sort of subjugates, but that doesn't mean that just using various sort of levers that allow you to change the way that mortgages and districting work suddenly is in itself something that involves subjugation. And so the idea here is clearly this is something that we need to be worried about, she wants to say, but it doesn't follow from using the intellectual, technical, material, institutional resources of archaeology that you're only going to recapitulate the same problems. As I said, I don't have much to say about paternalism, what I'm calling that. Why am I calling it that? Anyway, largely because I get the impression that that the answer is, well, yes, that's just obviously true, and that's just obviously something that we need to navigate. But this the final thing, the sort of no basis for criticism, is kind of interesting because in a sense we see at the very end of the paper Alison giving this kind of defense of a more sort of humble, a less sort of activist kind of archaeologist. And I think in a sense what's going on here is really she's saying, look, there is activism in archaeology, but that activism is about changing the institutional structure of archaeology, not about intervening in a sort of aggressive way, as it were, on the Indigenous groups you're working with. She points out, look, the tools of community archaeology are just the ones that do essentialize, right? It's exactly in going into these communities and talking to them about the way that they think about their heritage, the way they think about the sort of archaeological studies, that you're going to bring out the kind of differences. You know, the reactionaries will become very clear, is partly the idea. She says, it might be obvious, say, that a sovereigntist agenda, so that's an agenda that, you know, encourages autonomy and so forth in Indigenous groups, is what's called for. But successfully repurposing archaeological tools requires an ongoing process of learning what the stakes are, and strategies of disposition are ongoing when they're effective precisely because they are a moving target. So there's this kind of lesson here that's like, look, the kind of strategy you adopt as an archaeologist doing community archaeology has to be continually reflexive and also continually sensitive to various types of contexts. So I'm going to sort of leave basically almost leave the last words to Alison because I'm not really sure how else to explain this. So here's just sort of take on this sort of whole discussion. She says, using the master's tools, taking the stance of the disengaged critic. So remember what I was talking about, this kind of notion of scientific objectivity that involves disinterested or disengagedness, invoking the authority of elite expertise, even in service of social justice, may secure limited and short-term gains, primarily for those that deploy them, but as strategies that exploit extant hierarchies of power, they reproduce the divisive oppositions Lord calls on us to dismantle. So what's kind of interesting here is the archaeologists that's saying that they should act as expert activists. Alison is kind of turning the tables on them and saying, actually, it kind of looks like you're using the master's tools, to be honest. Alison's very good at saying things that are actually quite mean and aggressive, but in this way that's so so beautiful and kind of rich that you don't notice until you're like, hey, she actually said that they were the bad ones. That's interesting. And she says, the hope, courage, compassion, and solidarity of commitment to an ethic of human emancipation require radically different tools, ones grounded in a stance of epistemic and political humility that take a recognition of uncertainty and the need for situationally tuned and responsive engagement as their point of departure. She's saying something like this, look, using this kind of, in some sense, very unjudgmental kind of strategy of engaging with communities isn't wet liberalism. It is by no means post-political. In fact, she hopes and thinks that it is itself transformative of what archaeology is and what it could be. So through this, I think she's sort of picking out a bunch of things that she thinks are kind of unifying features of community archaeology. The first is this idea that community archaeology in part functions to question and change what archaeology is and what it is for. And crucially, part of this is thinking that, hey, there are some archaeological studies that I just shouldn't do. If I can't do it with the right type of relationship with the stakeholders, particularly, you know, Indigenous communities, hey, just don't do it. So this is the idea that community archaeology is supposed to be fundamentally challenging to archaeology. The second principle is the idea that there are good processes of engagement, whatever those are, and those in fact make for better science. So the second principle is this idea, doing community archaeology isn't, you know, it's not merely, as it were, a matter of sort of political engagement and thinking about social justice. It also makes you a better archaeologist. That's the sort of second principle. And the third, which is kind of the most unsurprising thing in the universe, is a kind of contextualism. There's no sort of success, there's no one way to successfully do community archaeology. And indeed, that, you know, that can be true for the same community over a period of time. And so it has to be extremely flexible. It has to involve, you know, one process, but many different processes. And the archaeologist, in collaboration with the community, is going to have to do sort of a lot of work. So that was me doing my best to try and summarize what I take these kinds of arguments to be. Let's take a 5-minute break, come back at 5 minutes to the hour, and we'll see if I made any sense. I felt like I was going at like a rollicking pace there, so that was okay. So I'm super interested in like what people's perspectives are on this. Why don't we start with Igor?
Uh, First of all, thank you for the great lecture. Like you did a great job in presenting this topic. Now, because a lot of us here are from the Balkans, we don't have to look further for example of colonialism and repatriation stuff when we can look in something we're far in the world when we have it right here. For example, like I come from Macedonia, and a lot of people here are from Serbia, and I'm sure that they are fully aware about uh, the the problem of Trebenište, the Great Necropolis, and some stuff that is kept like in the National Museum of Belgrade, and other stuff that is kept in the National Museum of in Sofia in Bulgaria, but they are excavated in Macedonia in Ohrid. So like in their presentation in the museum itself, they even don't state the country where it comes from. Like I see that a big problem. But now there is some other questions, like I am totally aware of the historical reality which happened, and I have no large hopes that some of those objects will be repatriated to Macedonia in any case. But because there is also another problem in the Balkans, its repatriation is not always positive, you say, because it is often tied to nationalism. So I think that if those objects are repatriated in Macedonia, they will be welcomed with nationalistic pride, and this has finally come to us, and I think that's a bad thing. So maybe the solution is more in, I don't know, I will be happy if the other side would give us like copies of the objects, something, but on their cost, or I don't know, like going too far to take a cut from museum tickets is a bit too far. However, even these relations between countries, some types of colonialism we can even see in the country itself, because I come from Resen, a Prespa, smaller part in town in Macedonia that is usually in the shadow of Ohrid and Skopje, and we have this problem that many archaeologists, professors have come from institutions and faculties in Prespa. They have excavated here and took the best archaeological remains in Skopje and Ohrid, and we are left with like local pottery and stuff that is unattractive. So that is also problems in the country itself. So I don't know. We have many examples here to think about it, and I think that maybe is some kind of compromise. Like I said, copies at the cost of the one who takes it and stuff like that. So
Yeah, no, I was hoping to make it at least a few minutes before Balkan politics came up,
yes,
because wow. But one thing that I think is really important and really about thinking about places like the Balkans in this context is how, in a sense, how comparatively simple the colonial context in sort of North America and Australia and New Zealand is, because in those contexts things are obviously extremely complicated, but nothing like this, right? Like, and as I think the thing I thought that was really important that you brought out there, Igor, was the way in which you've got these like at least dual forces between sort of nationalism and kind of repatriation, right? And I think that one's really, really complicated, right? Because of course, in lots of these countries, sort of going, oh, here's the stuff back, is going to sort of form this, very sort of nationalistic flavor. And I mean, I would be the last person to think I'm in any sort of position to make sense of it. But I suppose a sort of interesting question is something like, what's the way of putting it? How should you, in the context of somewhere like the Balkans, try and think about these kinds of challenges? Because, for instance, the way that scientists, at least, not archaeologists, sort of scientists generally, from at least, let's call it the West, are increasingly worried about sort of being exploitative when they're going in and finding medicines in other places and these kinds of things, but again, those seem in a sense kind of more simple, kind of more straightforward to describe than the sort of stuff that you get that you're describing. I mean, again, I don't think I'm in any position to say anything sensible. The idea of providing, I like the idea of providing copies. There's always, I guess, there's always this sort of what I think of as the sort of Istanbul solution, which is to say no one can have it. It's, this building is going to remain secular until you can play nice. Sort of, I don't know who gets to say that though. So it's yeah. I don't know if it's going to be a solution, but yeah, I'm really pleased that you managed to so succinctly capture that set of challenges. I suspect people are going to come in for some interesting takes on this. So let's go to Alexander.
Oh, thank you. I shall not be discussing the item that Igor just made about, but it is a good start because it addressed the question, what is indigenous? Who is our public? Who is the public, actually? And that is why I think that this Alison Wylie's paper is very important, because it addresses the need to be activists, that archaeologists need to be activists, and especially against the bad science. And this is the real issue here, because this is sort of abuse of idea of decolonization. Archaeologists, you don't have to be an archaeologist with a tropical helmet and go in Africa or Australia to excavate and to be a colonial archaeologist. As Leventhal said, the past is a foreign country, and you are always making some sort of colonization of the past. And that's why what Igor said is important and is a very hot and burning issue at the moment everywhere. But what if, for example, as in Balkans, and you are now in Romania, and we are in Serbia, and or some of our colleagues are in Bulgaria, Albania, or elsewhere, if the indigenous population is actually wanting and expecting of archaeologists to confirm or establish and confirm the idea that they are the most ancient people on this territory, ancestors, that they have a sort of historical right. For example, in Serbia, you have this idea that Lepenski Vir and Vinča proved that this is the first Europe, the first European civilization now, and that's why whole Europe and NATO and West is against us. And the similar idea you have in Bulgaria, in Macedonia, in Romania. You had similar stuff in Scandinavia. Alison Wylie mentions Israel. This idea is very, or Northern Ireland. So what is important is her idea that actually our activism should not be shallow and politically correct in a way that is modern in a way, but it should be actually epistemologically activism against bad science, because all these ideas, for example, nationalism in archaeology, and I think Božidar Slapšak said that archaeology can do without nationalism, but nationalism cannot do without archaeology. And this is really a problem when we are confronting these issues. So I really do hope that we shall have more of this discussion on Thursday with Alison Wylie.
Yeah, I imagine we did. We just, at the event I'm at here, we just had Dimitris Plantos, apologies for people who know what Greek sounds like. who is a sort of professor of archaeology in Greece, who was sort of speaking of, in this case, the use of sort of ancient DNA that's supposed to sort of establish, it's very important to establish that, you know, the Greek people, they didn't come from Africa, you see, and for some reason this is extremely important. What's that reason? Well, nationalism, right, and racism, you know. So I think there's the way in which archaeology and also anything genealogical, right, genetics as well, can be used for the service of these kind of very strange ideas that are tied into nationalism is very complicated. The ways in which I'm used to interacting with this actually is in contexts like Australia and North America, where sometimes ideas of having been there first, as it were, kind of play a role in grounding the sort of sovereignty claims of the sort of indigenous people. And so it's really interesting that there are contexts in which things that look really, really worrying in the context of some places are actually turn out to be kind of tools to fight oppression in other places. It's very confusing. But I think often what it means is that there are some studies that we just shouldn't do, right? And I think, and there are studies that we need to be very, very careful in terms of how we do them. Is the sort of sense that I get. But yeah, Alexander, you're absolutely right. This is something that I should have mentioned, actually, especially in light of having been to Dimitri's talk, that there's this whole other element that's going on, which is the way in which history, which archaeology tells us about, I take it, really, really shapes not just identity, but also sometimes rights, right? It turns out in some parts of Australia, it matters whether or not your people have been there for a long time or not, which is kind of strange to me. But also they're very easily co-opted by kind of nationalistic, sort of harmful voices. And I often think the following, like the reason why I think it's really important to be a sort of realist about history is precisely because that often makes it harder for it to be co-opted in those kinds of ways. But that's kind of just my sort of take on it. Stasha, do you want to come in?
Well, thank you for finishing this whole series of talks and lectures by this particular paper and by this particular author, because I don't think any course of this kind could be complete without Alison Wylie. So thanks a lot for it. And this, just like any other of her texts, it raises so many questions. And one set of questions is the one that Igor picked up, and Sasha also, Alexander also talked about, that we all wrote about, and archaeologists have been doing stuff about uses and abuses of archaeological past in political context for decades now. So it's quite an important issue, and the one that really deserves its own set of courses, not only one. So I won't dwell on it, because that's one of the issues that I feel very strongly about, but I don't think that we should bore philosophers with it much more right now. What I would like to pick on right now is the whole story that Alison Wylie articulates in many of her writings and touches upon in this one, which is the standpoint theory, which might be interesting not only in terms of abuses in nationalist and political fights of any kind, but the point that she articulates so nicely, that we all stand somewhere and not look from the above, a look from nowhere, which is a completely objective take of the reality. We always have to do it from somewhere, whether we are archaeologists, biologists, or any kind of observers, disciplinary observers of the world. We always have some vested interest in what we are doing. And she articulates it so nicely in this particular context again. We have to be aware of it. And it is my strong feeling that the most efficient way of being objective is to say, well, this is where I stand. This is where I try to articulate my point from. And that is why I'm saying this and that. And that is what informs my observations and my conclusions and my interpretations of the past or whatnot. And that is, in my opinion, what she's talking about when she's talking about epistemic humility. And that I think is a thing which is much more pervasive for our discussions over here than the post-colonial subject, which is of course very important in its own right. But I'm just trying to put a thing into the whole discussion into a more general context about how we do things when we research the past. So That was
Yeah, no, that was really beautifully put. Yeah, so one of the sort of more general lessons we might extract from this, and also lots of sort of Alison's work, right? Something I've always found kind of interesting is how rarely she brings her work on standpoint epistemology explicitly into her work on the philosophy of archaeology, and yet it's kind of there the whole time.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And one of the things that I think is really, that I think is really sort of interesting and sort of ties into, I know that she's, heavily influenced by people like Joan Guerra as well. There's this kind of idea that, to do good science, you have to really, well, you should make really explicit things that scientists often try and hide because they think it sort of hides their objectivity. And we've kind of seen that cropping up throughout the whole course, right? In these very, very apparently apolitical ways, right? So particularly with the notion of sort of invisibility in the discussion with Caitlin Wiley. But it's interesting that here actually, look, it turns out that anytime you're doing science, you're doing it with a particular set of goals. You've got a thing that or at least you and your club, if you want, are kind of interested in doing. And one of the things that's so worrying in a sense about science is the way that it presents itself, as you say, like it was a view from nowhere. And no philosopher of science, well, actually probably to be honest, a fair number of philosophers of science probably kind of like that, but like no one who I'm friends with. But certainly no historians or sociologists or anthropologists of science would ever think that there was such a thing as a sort of view from nowhere. And yet it's this thing that you can just sort of see scientists acting as if they sort of have that. And I think it's interesting to think about what kinds of strategies scientists should, if I'm a geneticist, how do I make it clear what I'm in the business of doing? How do I make my agenda explicit? And I think quite often when you think about ways they might do this, it kind of involves sort of giving the game away. If you're sort of doing ancient DNA stuff and you say something like, oh, I'm just interested in like publishing papers where I can show statistical relationships with demographic patterns, I don't know what kinship is. Or something like that. That kind of gives the game away in a certain way, but in a way that it would be great because it would cause a whole lot less confusion. Do come back, Stasha, I'm sure you.
No, well, we could talk hours about this. What I like about archaeology and what I make much clearer to me when I'm listening to other people from outside the discipline talking about it is how useful we can be, because what we do involves both DNA and symbolic stuff that's being done on I don't know, cave paintings and stuff. So we are so very wide in what we are doing, and the very character of our record, of our database, is so very diverse that makes us very, I think, interesting for you to observe. Because
yeah, I mean that's yeah. So one of the things, what are archaeologists good at? Well, they're good at integrating stuff. And like,
yeah, well, thank you.
Integrating stuff is really hard. Joe, do you want to come in?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Actually, that's a great segue to what I wanted to, what I'm curious about. I was wondering, sort of as you were talking about it during the presentation, if if there's something unique to archaeology, such that community archaeology is a useful and necessary program, and if not, sort of what is it about archaeology that might also be true of other, in my brain I'm thinking of historical sciences, but we can go beyond it, other historical sciences, such that we might call for some sort of community version of that, because on a very liberal application of something like Douglas's values in science view, paleoclimatology or paleontology are going to be clearly value laden because they have some import for contemporary political discourse. Mm-hmm. And thus it would be interesting to consider, well, does that mean we should call for a community paleontology, a community paleoclimatology, and what would that mean?
There's a sense in which these versions of these kind of exist. So one interesting place to look at is the way in which there's a sort of awkward thing going on at the moment, which goes something like this. And I don't know heaps about this, so I may not say this very well, but roughly, like, where are all the major finds coming in paleontology at the moment? Well, they're coming out of China. Who's publishing those papers? Well, kind of Anglophone with Chinese sort of paleontologists, and there's this kind of interesting kind of interactions. I've talked to some of the sort of vertebrate paleontologists who are sort of doing this, and there's this kind of interesting sort of, they're very aware that they're coming with a certain level of kind of authority, and it's useful for the sort of Chinese paleontologists to be able to ride on that kind of authority in a certain type of way. So like Phil Currie sort of talks a bit like this. And there's a kind of, but of course they also, the Anglophone people need the damn fossils. And there's this kind of idea that downstream, they'll be able to like stand back and let those groups and let the sort of Chinese folks use their own thing. It's very weird. And it's got this real like, especially because like paleontologists are not used to thinking like that, and you can see how kind of a bit uncomfortable they often are with it, and I mean rightly so. But I think it's very straightforward to sort of go, look, you know, a lot of like, I mean, here's you know, a lot of fossils were in. Think about the bone wars. You know, 19th century. You've got land that was once you know, the homes of you know, indigenous people, and you've got these like dudes with big beards going in and just tearing up huge amounts of these incredibly valuable, you know, things about our histories, and then owning them, right? It's extractive in a certain kind of way, right? And so I think that like paleontology kind of hits this pretty heavily in lots of ways. In terms of sort of the more general question, right? So I do think that there are, and people, I think this has already come up a bit, right? Archaeology feeds into history, and history plays this crucial role in the way people see themselves. And I don't think that makes it, that certainly doesn't make it unique, right? I imagine, you know, there's a reason that historians also have to worry about decolonization, but there's this kind of extremely material aspect to archaeology as well, right? You need some objects to poke, and you need to get the objects from somewhere, right? And so I do think that, I think this is something that in some sense infects, you know, all science, right? I think clearly, insofar as you say, Joe, insofar as all science is going to be value laden, it's probably also going to be part of this insert kind of colonial, you know, sort of structures. But you might think the following: archaeology is both sort of well positioned to confront this stuff because it's about history and because it's about material culture. And you might think that that makes it, you know, particularly pressing for archaeology, but you might think it also makes archaeology particularly well positioned to kind of make these arguments and to make these kinds of movements and to push back against those structures, right? So there's this kind of interesting sort of dual thing here where on the one hand, archaeology is kind of the most, you know, very easily used as a kind of tool for oppression in sort of interesting ways, but it's almost precisely because of that it's like potentially a great way of I'm not very good at using this language that, you know, a tool for liberation or something like this. Yeah, I mean, do feel free to come back, Joe.
Yeah, no, that sounds right. And more I was thinking that just in maybe some of the more natural historical sciences, there's going to be maybe either less of a proportion of the hypotheses, or it's less likely that any given hypothesis is going to be relevant for any of the contemporary political or ideological debates going on, or self-image. And so being more directed towards human history and how human history is tied into our contemporary image of self and and what's important for us. Yeah, I think that's sort of where I was wondering how fine-grained that distinction is, or how fine-grained that division is between the human-centered sciences and the non-human-centered sciences really are. Because at least under some of the things I was suggesting, sort of in line with this Douglas line, there really isn't anything more than a difference in. It's not a difference in kind; it's a difference in emphasis or something.
Yeah, the way I would characterize it is just that there's different levels of inductive risk, right? There are some places where getting it wrong or getting co-opted is really bad, and there are some places where who cares why the dinosaurs died out, you know.
Perfect.
And so, and so that's how I tend to think about these things. Let's go to the big room.
Okay, so this was a very exciting paper to read, and sort of the way that you presented the issue as well, although it was a bit sort of analytic, kind of a little, yeah. I mean, not that I didn't like that, but it's just sort of a different kind of a register. And it's all very interesting and exciting, and all these various sort of approaches in different contexts. But I would like to go back to something that Alexander actually sort of mentioned and that sort of problematized. In all this, it seems that one of the consequences is that archaeologists can offer to the public and to the scientific community almost kind of a very subtle kind of doing politics, sort of a public politics, and it's fine. And you know, there's nothing wrong with that. And in a sense, it's now the question is, what exactly makes this sort of politics and political engagement kind of a subtle, right? And what could it be? Well, scientific methods, one way or the other, right? What else could it be, really? So, I mean, it seems to me, I mean, this is sort of, I feel uneasy not emphasizing this, that there has to be something to scientific methods that really delineates them from politics as such. So, I mean, when I talk to, yeah, I know, it's, but when I talk to kind of, you know, logical positivists among, I don't know, biologists, I will always go in the opposite direction and say, well, look, things are not that simple, and especially if you're dealing with, you know, people and history, you know, your methods always bleed into the kind of political. And but here it seems to me it's so exciting to outline this political field in which archaeology is kind of buried, that, like, you know, I kind of feel that we really need a bit sharper distinction between political and kind of methodological, if possible at all, right? I mean, it's not an easy task, maybe it's impossible, but
I can feel the sort of pull of the sort of points you're making. I very much what's the right putting it? Recognize the sort of, you go and talk to sort of some biologists and you start going, no, it's not how it works. And then when you sort of are confronted with this much more kind of sort of pluralistic thing, I start finding like, no, there's something, come on, we want some kind of distinction here. And I think one thing that's interesting about Alison's work is she's very, very good at kind of going, no, science gets us true stuff. Like, this is not sort of, it would be a real mistake to construe this, and you're not saying this, but it would be a mistake to construe this as somehow anti-scientific. So Alison definitely thinks, of course, that the political and the scientific can't be separated, but I think she nonetheless thinks that we can think about, in some sense, science as a set of processes which, you know, really do generate sort of incredibly rich knowledge and truth and all this kind of stuff. And whether we want to call that sort of the scientific method or something, I'm not really sure. And there's a sort of question about how it is we're supposed to, because of course, as I'm sure many of you have noticed, I tend to talk about, you know, when I'm talking about the political aspect of science, what I often mean is something like the way science is funded, the power structures within the lab, something like this, as opposed to fighting back against global hegemony or anything strong like that, right? And I think part of this is to do with the way that we sort of idealize and set our targets when we're trying to explain things as philosophers of science. And I think that, so sort of saying that scientific method is kind of unavoidably political, which is to say something like the questions I ask, the methods I take up, the structures that I choose to, you know, well, let's use the word choose with some quotation marks, choose to sort of embed myself and my work within or whatever, is inevitably involves political stuff. That doesn't mean that we're not able to analyze sort of scientific procedures and methods as being things which are in the business of generating certain types of truth. So I think that the kind of, I mean, so the perspective that I try to take from Alison, and I don't know if it would be interesting to put this to her, because I'd love to hear her answer to this question, is that there isn't really actually a straightforward tension between thinking that the set of things we call science are very, very good at generating, various types of very, very useful knowledge and so on and so forth, being a realist if you want, while also saying that it is sort of cut through with this kind of politics and perspectivalism and standpoint stuff. I'm not great at articulating it, but I think that's the sort of move that's going on here. We tend to act as if these things are dichotomous. Maybe a way of putting it is if we take what Stasha was saying seriously, look, we all sort of stand somewhere, and where we stand is often sort of political, then the very idea that I might be able to talk about scientific methods absolutely abstracted from these sort of political things is itself kind of a mistake. But insofar as we think that science produces, good knowledge, then the fact that it's infused with politics and the fact that we all have different standpoints can't be a thing that makes it impossible for us to do so, I guess.
Yeah.
I think I just gave a transcendental argument, and I'm really sorry.
Yeah, but it's sort of that reading Wylie's text is really exciting, but then I kind of expected like more analytic and kind of a conclusion or a one-liner that's not coming. But anyways, yeah, thanks for the for the answer. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's true. Yes. So we have another question here, but archaeologist Ivana.
Thank you. I just want to draw on this comment on scientific practice, because I thought I wanted to I want to share something that I asked Slobodan a couple of weeks ago, actually. I asked him, isn't every science historical science, in a sense that, both knowledge and beliefs and the way we are doing it shifts diachronically? And we had a discussion about it, but I won't go into take too much time now. But what I'm meaning to say is, isn't it that with the discovery of say microscopes, telescopes, the phenomena we study shift so drastically, and our knowledge of the world. So what I'm saying is surely not that phenomena are constructs, but that it's always an engagement of the phenomena and our perception of the phenomena. So in that sense, I mean, political and natural, or say that old nature-culture dichotomy is, I think, drawing us back, and I think it's time to remove ourselves from these strict dichotomies, because I think it's much more fruitful to do science when we're not on one or the other side of this divide. Just my 2 cents.
Oh, that was beautifully said. Thank you. I think, yeah. So how do I want to put this? So when we say that all sciences are historical, there's a few things we might mean. One thing we might mean is the history of a science always matters. Definitely true. Another thing we might mean is sciences are always, the target of science is always historical. Now that one you might think is false, right? You might think that if I'm a chemist or I'm a physicist or I'm a biologist of some stripes, at least sometimes I'm interested in the future, or interested in the present or something like this. But I'm inclined to think that the lesson I take from sort of work on the nature of data that's been going in the philosophy of science is that anytime I try and make an evidential claim, I'm relying on the history of that data. I'm relying on, where did it come from? How has it traveled? How has it been transformed? Metadata always matters when I'm making an inference. And because metadata is historical, metadata is telling about the provenance of the data. Anytime someone's making a claim about data, they are making an historical inference of sorts, which is something that I find kind of amusing, right? It turns out that every scientist ends up speaking about the past in these ways. It may be that, so I'm not sure which of those, you or me, may mean something else, but I think you're absolutely right that, I think on both counts, these are both really, really important things to keep in mind when we're thinking about science. And it's something that, again, it's one of these things that many scientists try and hide, right? Again, the way in which scientists try and act as if it's not just that it's a view from nowhere, it's a view without time. It's a view that's just, hey, here's how this law works. If you do this experiment, this is the result you'll get. Doesn't matter when you're doing it. That's another thing which seems kind of just straightforwardly false, but a sort of myth that science perpetuates. I've never thought about that before. That's fun. We should finish up soon, but I wanted, Stasha wanted to come back in, so maybe we should give the last word to her.
Well, I just wanted to point out the way the conversation was going, especially when Slobodan was talking. It again brought up the feeling that politics is something extremely dirty by and in itself. So we have to avoid it at any cost, because politics is something dirty, awful, and shouldn't be messed up with science. And I would just like to say, well, I feel obliged to say that politics doesn't really have to be something ugly. And perhaps we are very wrong in our everyday civil lives by thinking that politics is something that should be and has to be and is always dirty and we have to avoid it. Perhaps we should get involved into it as scientists and make it better. So it's my activist claim.
I mean, I think we should definitely just end with that one. I think that was a wonderful sort of provocative way to end this discussion. It's going to be very interesting to talk to you all in 2 days with Alison. We'll see how it goes. Thank you so much. I learned a lot from the last sort of half an hour, so thank you so much. Talk to you all in a few days.